Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the next webinar in our CCS Talks programme, the Acorn Project and Scotland's contribution to net zero. My name is Jamie Burrows and I'm the Client Engagement Manager at the Global CCS Institute. For those of you who are not familiar with us, the Institute is a think tank that's focused on accelerating the deployment of carbon capture and storage. We have offices in Melbourne, Tokyo, Beijing, Brussels, London, Washington DC. We're now in the process of opening our office in Abu Dhabi. A few words regarding housekeeping to start. Today's webinar will be roughly 1 hour long. In the coming days, we'll make a recording of the webinar available through the Institute's website. You can make adjustments to your audio and visual settings through the Zoom control panel. Towards the end of today's session, I'll pose some of your questions to today's speakers. You can submit your questions throughout the presentations today using the Zoom control panel, and we'll endeavour to cover as many of those questions as time permits at the end of today's session. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Andy Hogg, Mike Smith, and Kirsty Lynch. Andy Hogg is the Deputy Director for Energy Industries at the Scottish Government. Andy has held his role since January 2019. His previous roles in Scottish Government include Head of Oil and Gas and Industrial Decarbonisation, Head of Macroeconomics and Fiscal Analysis, and Economic Advisor to the First Minister of Scotland. And his current responsibilities include hydrogen, carbon capture, utilisation and storage, oil and gas, decommissioning, and industrial decarbonisation. Mike Smith is the Chief Executive Officer of NECCUS. NECCUS is an alliance of industry, academia, and government which aims to enable the development of the first industrial-scale CCUS project in Scotland. Mike has extensive leadership experience in the energy sector. He recently held senior leadership roles at INEOS and Ørsted with exposure to oil and gas and the renewables industries. Kirsty Lynch is Communications Director at Pale Blue Dot. Kirsty combines 10 years experience working internationally in the low-carbon energy industry with deep expertise and enthusiasm for public engagement and education. Kirsty joined Pale Blue Dot in 2018 after more than 6 years with the Global CCS Institute. Kirsty also has nearly 4 years of project delivery experience, having managed the stakeholder and knowledge sharing activities of one of the early UK carbon capture and storage projects. Welcome. So I'd like to begin today by sharing some background to today's webinar. The Climate Change Act 2019 sets targets to reduce Scotland's emissions of all greenhouse gases to net zero by 2045 at the latest, with interim targets for reductions of 75% by 2030 and 90% by 2040, measured against 1990 levels. CCS will play a key role in delivering Scotland's climate targets. The Acorn Project aims to provide a carbon capture and storage capability for Scotland by the mid-2020s, leveraging existing offshore infrastructure and one of the UK's first CO2 appraisal and storage licenses. Building on the Acorn Project, a net zero roadmap has been developed showing how a CCS network could be developed to decarbonise major emission sources across Scotland. Beyond Scotland, Acorn aims to support other carbon reduction projects both in the UK and elsewhere in Europe. Okay. To begin, I'm going to hand over to Andy Hogg, who's going to speak about Scotland's net zero commitment and the role that CCS will play in that. Andy, over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Jamie, and thanks for that introduction. Firstly, just to say it's great for the opportunity to speak at the event today. Thanks for the invite, and it's good to speak here on behalf of Scottish Government, and also really happy to join Kirsty and Mike on the panel today, so thanks for that. I guess what I wanted to do is kick us off today with a little bit of an overview of Scotland's devolved climate change legislation that you just mentioned there. I want to talk a little bit about the framework we use to coordinate policy action across the Scottish Government, and particularly focus in on some of the key sectors there, so industry and power. The sectors that really are going to require some deep decarbonisation action that CCS is going to be so core to. So if you move me on to my first slide, Jamie, I'll start to talk through that. And I think that the best place to start is probably those statutory frameworks and targets that you mentioned there. So obviously, as you mentioned, the Scottish Government set and Scottish Parliament confirmed a highly ambitious target of 75% emissions reduction by 2030 compared to our 1990 baseline. And that is a step on the way to our net zero target by 2045. Now, these were enshrined into legislation in the 2019 Act. But a couple of things to draw out from that legislation. Firstly, the stretching nature of those targets, in particular the 2030 target, in which our independent advisors, the Committee on Climate Change, recognised as going above and beyond what was required of Scotland's proportionate share of the Paris commitment. So secondly, also, is the way we report upon these targets. So our targets are actually annual targets that we report to Parliament on every single year. Now, that's a little bit different from the framework used across the UK as a whole, which kind of focuses around multi-year carbon budgets. So quite a prescriptive monitoring of that target. The mechanism we use to pull information together and to coordinate policy action in government is called our Climate Change Plan. And that plan was published last in 2018. However, when we updated the legislation and the new targets, we updated that plan in December of 2020, and we refreshed it so that it was commensurate with the targets that we had, with over 100 new policies and proposals aligned with the targets and the trajectory of emissions reduction required. Now, the way our plan works is it takes a sector by sector approach. So the chart that I've got on the slide shows the kind of breakdown of that. By sector, what I mean are things like transport, industry, electricity, and that's what you can see in the chart. And in order to deliver emissions reductions in our targets, each of the sectors in the climate change plan has been inside an envelope, or we call it an envelope, effectively an emissions reduction pathway. And these envelopes are not sector by sector statutory targets, but they give policymakers a guide in terms of the emissions reduction effort required and accountability for the policies that are designed in those sectors. Now, for a bit of context there, CCS in itself is not a sector in our plan. But it is integral and critical for all of the industry sector decarbonisation efforts, the electricity sector decarbonisation efforts, and also the chart you see below the baseline there, which is actually increasing use of negative emission technologies or greenhouse gas removal technologies, which our plan does rely on. So I'll maybe dive a bit deeper into a couple of those sectors just to unpack it a bit. So if you go on to the next slide, Jamie, I'll talk through some of our plans for industry. Now, industrial emissions in Scotland account for about 30% of our total emissions. Now, these emissions predominantly come from manufacturing sectors, energy intensive industries, some of the mining, construction, and a number of other kind of high priority areas. These are fundamental to the Scottish economy and employ about more than 300,000 people in what are generally highly skilled and highly paid jobs. That's therefore the kind of foundation of what we are doing in much of the policy and industrial decarbonisation is centred around just transition. So in Scotland, we established a Just Transition Commission to advise us on some of the policies required to implement this transition. It came reported earlier this year with a range of different recommendations, and our incoming government, which was elected in May, has agreed and committed to take on board all of the recommendations from that Just Transition report, including things like the commitment to bring forward just transition plans, charting the transition of sites, industries, regions and communities. So the work Mike's going to talk about today and the NECCUS are leading on is going to be really critical for some of that work. And we've got a new Just Transition Minister in Richard Lockhead that is coming into post with going to lead some of this work for us and oversee some of the activity we're doing. I guess policy and industry though is traditionally be considered one of those hard to treat sectors, no easy silver bullet decarbonisation options. And that's been the kind of background to some of the decarbonisation options. However, we've seen real development in that in recent years. And the CCPU, in recognising this developments coming forward, commits to taking a really sequenced and strategic approach to decarbonising our industrial sectors, not pushing forward at a pace that's going to see offshoring of emissions or decarbonisation by deindustrialisation. We want to bring forward the technologies and the processes and the investment that will decarbonise those sectors and keep the activity here in Scotland. Therefore, some of the key work we've been doing around things like our hydrogen policy statement, which is intricately connected with our CCS ambitions, really drew out some of that thinking. If you move on to electricity now, Jamie. So electricity is another sector where CCS has a really important role to play. With the electricity sector in Scotland, you've really got to look at this through two lenses. Firstly, the significant progress that's been made in already moving to a very low carbon system. In Scotland, over 97% of the electricity we consume in Scotland now comes from renewable sources, which is a really significantly low carbon grid. However, the targets that I mentioned earlier require us to move from that low carbon generation system to a zero carbon system over the course of this decade, and also in a way that actually allows a system resilience and security, and the potential to connect some of these negative emissions technologies to it. And by negative emissions technologies, I mean things like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, that are required to actually take us towards the net zero targets. And we actually need to develop some of these technologies and bring them forward over the course of this decade and early into next. And our plan actually sees significant levels of nets over 5 megatons by the early part of next decade. And that's why it's also really encouraging to see the work with SSE are leading on Peterhead CCS, also connected with the projects we're going to discuss today, because that is would take one of our remaining fossil fuel stations and replace that with a new carbon capture and storage system that could be really quite, that would bring that much lower emissions down. And just to draw out a few of our policy ambitions around some of this, the next slide talks through some of the priorities that we've set in Scottish Government. So as a starting point, our policy on CCS very much aligns with what the Committee on Climate Change have recommended, and that they see CCS as being a critical part of the transition to net zero. And in fact, moreover than that, in our modelling for the climate change plan, we could not find a technically feasible route to our net zero targets without the deployment of CCS in Scotland. Therefore, some of the policies we're bringing forward as part of the climate change plan and elsewhere are enabling this. So along with our CCPU, one of the things we published was our hydrogen policy statement, which committed to both Scotland deploying 5 gigawatts of both green and blue hydrogen combined by 2030, which is a significant ambition of deployment in Scotland. And to support that, we've introduced new funding schemes. We launched an Emerging Energy Technologies Fund with £180 million of funding over the next 5 years, and also a smaller, more targeted pot of funding on looking at carbon capture utilisation, with a view of trying to pump prime and encourage some of the capture and use of CO2 in our manufacturing clusters. And we recognise that there's still a lot to understand and learn around things like the use of bioenergy and negative emissions technologies. So we've committed to do some significant feasibility work and understanding all of the key sustainability issues around the use of bioenergy with carbon capture. And I guess the key thing to get across here is the design principle in our policies here is to ensure that the support and the policies we are bringing forward are complementary to those that have been developed across the UK as a whole. So the UK are leading some significant pieces of work just now in developing business models for carbon capture and hydrogen deployment, and things like the cluster sequencing process, which we'll hear about today, which I think are going to be really important in getting these technologies and projects up to scale. And our design principle and our funding and our policies is to design them in a way that is complementary to those UK-wide regulatory mechanisms. And just to finish, Jamie, on the last slide, just want to touch a little bit on opportunities and ambition. Now, I think I've talked a lot so far about how we see CCS as having a really important role in our net zero targets. I think we actually see Scotland as having some really significant advantages, both natural and economic, in developing a CCS sector. Now, I won't plan to go into these in much depth just now due to time, and I also think Mike is going to take us through some of these in a bit more detail. So I'll leave that for Mike, but I also want to just say that along with our natural and economic advantages, I think the development of CCS in Scotland has really strong alignment to some of our policy ambitions. Some of the wider work we are doing around industrial transition and industrial cluster development, working with the Grangemouth cluster, working with retrofitting our existing energy intensive industries, is really aligned with the development of a CCS sector in Scotland. And I think one of the things I'd like to see coming out of the project development over the next few years is real greater collaboration between our industrial clusters and some of these projects. And finally, I think as we head towards COP26 in Glasgow in November, the Scottish Government is really keen to maximise the opportunity that all of this presents. We have energy policy as one of our key themes that we want to shout about during COP. And I don't want to stray too far into the work that Mike and Kirsty are going to talk about just now, but I think the work that these organisations are progressing in things like Scotland's Net Zero Roadmap and Scotland's Net Zero Infrastructure projects is the exact type of thing we want to see and champion as part of that process. So I think I'll pause there, Mike, and hopefully that gives you a good overview of SG policy in this space.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Andy. Really great to learn more about Scotland's net zero commitment and ambition there in the background. Obviously, a lot going on at this time. A quick question for you before we pass across to Mike. The Scottish Government have responded very quickly to the establishment of the Climate Change Act 2019. CCS is clearly important to the delivery of net zero by 2045. Can you comment on the role of CCS in meeting the interim targets of a 75% reduction by 2030 and a 90% reduction by 2040?
Yes, happy to. So I guess there's a couple of parts to that. There's the pace part about responding quickly, and then also the role of CCS. And I think on pace, that's something we recognise is really important. So I mean, it's not that long ago our First Minister declared a climate emergency back in April 2019. We moved quite quickly from there to enshrining and gaining royal assent for our Climate Change Act. And actually from that, realised that targets do not solve the problem. You need delivery and actions and policies. So actually, as part of once the Act was in place, government itself committed quite quickly to bringing forward our climate change plan update. We didn't wait the 5-year cycle we were intending to. We brought it forward and updated that in December of last year. And I think in terms of the role CCS plays in that, and particularly for the 2030 target, I think it's really important. So I mentioned briefly in the presentation that the Committee on Climate Change recognised that our 2030 target was above and beyond and faster than what they would have recommended as a proportionate share of Scotland's contribution to the Paris Agreement. And I think that's right. But in identifying that, and in advice to us as part of the 6th carbon budget, the CCC pointed out several areas that they identified that if we're going to meet that enhanced target and in that enhanced pace, particularly over the period to 2030, we're going to have to go faster. And the 4 areas the CCC identified were bringing forward and advancing the commencement of greenhouse gas removals faster potentially than the UK will as a whole, and in other regions as well. Early decarbonisation of the Grangemouth cluster, which is our largest industrial cluster and accounts for well over 2 megatons of emissions. Accelerated scrappage of high carbon assets, things like existing boilers, or even in the transport sector, existing cars. And increased rollout of heat decarbonisation were the 4 areas, with a particular focus on sort of hybrid heat pumps. So of those 4 areas that the CCC recommended we need to do more quickly, 2 of them rely heavily on CCS. The first 2, greenhouse gas removals and Grangemouth decarbonisation, are integral with CCS. So I think in terms of CCS's role, it's really central to achieving those targets, we believe.
That's great. Thanks very much, Andy. Really appreciate your insight there. We'll return to you at the end of today's session with some of the audience members' questions. But for now, let's move on. Let's move across to Mike Smith, who's going to tell us a little bit more about Scotland's net zero roadmap. Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Jamie, and thanks for the opportunity today. Yes, I'm here to talk about Scotland's net zero roadmap. That's one of 6 roadmaps that are currently being developed across the UK. Those roadmaps are based in the largest industrial clusters as identified by the UK government. And all 6 of those roadmaps are partly being funded by our government funding body, UKRI, Innovate UK. And here in Scotland, that funding is being matched by industry, and you can see on the screen there the industrial players who are supporting this roadmap and providing direct funding for the project. And they represent some of the largest industrial players across Scotland, some of them key infrastructure owners, and indeed some of the bodies who will have a hand in some of the regulation of this as we move forward. So we're very pleased to have them on board and supporting us. And whilst NECCUS, as the Scottish Association for Industrial Decarbonisation, is leading the project, we couldn't deliver it on our own. We have a fantastic group of partners, and you can see the project partners listed on the bottom of this slide. Those partners represent some of the leading academic groups in Scotland. They represent some of the leading research and technology organisations, some of the existing project developers in this space, and also some of the leading supply chain and technology organisations that are delivering industrial decarbonisation projects across the globe as we speak. But if I move to the next slide, what I want to start with before we even think about developing a roadmap for a large industrial area such as Scotland, we need to first think about what strengths can you lean into in that roadmap. You want to always take advantage of the natural strengths that you might have. And we're fortunate in Scotland that we have several key strengths, and I'm going to step through those one by one. The first of those strengths is largely a legacy of both our rich industrial heritage, but also the significant amount of oil and gas exploration and development that has occurred in the past. We have significant amounts of existing infrastructure. That infrastructure can be repurposed and reused, and it includes multiple onshore pipelines and multiple offshore pipelines, as you see on the screen, as well as a significant amount of existing deep water port infrastructure, where those deep water ports can use, have experience and currently use large liquefied products such as LPG, and therefore could potentially have the operational capability to transit to other large liquefied mediums such as CO2 and hydrogen. And it's important to have this infrastructure, and it's important to have multiple redundancies within that infrastructure, because the hard reality is, whilst we are developing CO2 and hydrogen infrastructure, we will need to maintain the existing natural gas grid for many years to come. So having multiple lines and having some of those lines that are coming to the end of their useful life for natural gas allows us to reuse and repurpose them. The second strength that you've seen built on the screen there, and that was already alluded to by Andy, is Scotland has, for the UK as a whole, by far the largest CO2 storage potential. The British Geological Survey identified across the whole of the United Kingdom continental shelf approximately 70 gigatons of storage potential. 65% of that is in Scottish waters, and so that represents a huge opportunity both to Scotland but also to the rest of the UK and ultimately to the rest of Europe to provide a CO2 storage management resource that can be utilised more widely. If you build to the next point, which complements quite nicely the CO2 storage potential, and that's the fact that Scotland also is seeing one of the largest build-outs of renewable energy, again, as Andy has highlighted, and we are going to see significant build-outs of offshore wind potential over the coming years. They're highlighted in the hatched areas that you see on the screen, and that's a mixture of approximately 6 gigawatts of offshore wind that is currently under some sort of consenting or planning process, and a further 8 that is potentially up for planning and permitting in the near future. That offshore wind potential allows us to significantly increase our renewable electrification, but also that offshore wind is potentially in the right kind of places and is primed for us to utilize for green hydrogen, which could complement blue hydrogen and start to build out that hydrogen economy that we'd like to see developed across Scotland and the rest of the UK. To do all of that, we need a workforce. And we're fortunate again in Scotland that we have a large and highly skilled workforce from our industrial heritage and also from oil and gas that we can redeploy. They have the skills, they have the manufacturing capability, and they have the technological IP that we can redeploy into CCS. And we also have some of the leading academic groups that have led the academic research into carbon capture and storage for many years, and they happen to be based in Scotland, including the newly announced Industrial Decarbonisation Research and Innovation Centre that is based at Heriot-Watt, just outside of Edinburgh. And because of all of that, the last point that we have in terms of our strengths is we have a multitude of ongoing projects. And those projects cover multiple elements of what we might need if we are to ultimately achieve net zero. So I won't go through those projects in detail, but I simply wanted to highlight they cover, as well as carbon capture and storage, they cover also the utilization of CO2, greenhouse gas removal technologies such as direct air capture, and multiple projects around both blue and green hydrogen, with blue hydrogen being hydrogen from steam methane reformation, green hydrogen being via electrolysis. All of that coupled together, we believe allows us to deliver on the significant ambitious targets that Scotland has and deliver decarbonisation for industry at pace in a scalable manner and one that is highly effective for industrial needs. So those strengths lead into our next slide, which is starting to look at, so with those strengths, what is the obvious area for us to focus on if we think about decarbonising a large industrial cluster? And we have focused effectively on the east coast of Scotland. It's a region that covers some 80% of all of Scotland's industrial emissions. They account in aggregate for about 9 million tonnes of CO2. And it's a region that goes from Lothian in the south of Scotland up to Aberdeenshire. We, in that region, have identified 28 large industrial sites. We've also identified 3 key subclusters that represent the vast majority of the 9 million tonnes of CO2 per annum that we're trying to address. And those subclusters are in Aberdeenshire, in the Fife region, and down in Grangemouth. And those 28 sites also cover multiple industries. And that's really important when you think about developing a coherent and integrated roadmap for net zero, because different industries will lean into different technological solutions and at different scales and at different levels of pace. So by looking at multiple industries across this region, we believe that overall we can deliver something that is practical and investable, whilst recognizing that there is potentially multiple pathways. So we will be considering the different scenarios that could help us to achieve this net zero roadmap. So that's the area that we're thinking about. I'm now going to cover a couple of the main parts of our roadmap thinking and how they will all come together to build a roadmap overall. And the first one of those is to think about the technologies that we might need to deploy. So on the next slide, we cover that technology deployment. Some of our partners are working very closely on this as we speak. We did a development exercise in the summer of last year, where we went out to some of the main stakeholders. We did a large stakeholder engagement exercise to look at across those sites, what sort of technological pathways might they be wishing to use to delve into for their own sites to achieve net zero on a site basis. You can see that on the left-hand side of the screen. Obvious candidates: hydrogen fuel switching, carbon capture and storage, potentially the utilization of CO2, greater electrification, and indeed greenhouse gas removal technologies are all seen as having potential. Unsurprisingly, therefore, we are looking at screening all of those technologies, looking at what technologies are deployable today, looking at what disruptive technologies could come along in the timeframe between now and 2045, which is when Scotland has to achieve net zero, and how they can be rolled out, and increasingly importantly, looking at the technology cost pathways that we see for each of these when we look at the deployment of a learning curve and also the deployment of a cost reduction curve as you scale up the deployment of these technologies. So that helps us to think about the technologies that might be used and also how those technologies could change over time. The next factor is then to think about how those technologies can be applied on a site-by-site basis. Each site is unique, and if we look at the next slide, we need to recognize the unique aspects of each site. We also need to recognize that if you think across some of the key industrial sectors, each sector has multiple options when it comes to its own journey to net zero. And therefore, each individual industrial site is likely to have multiple options. And therefore, we are very likely to see a sequence of decarbonising investments that move any particular site from its current emissions today to net zero, ideally ahead of the national target of 2045. You can see on the screen there some of the options that are available, and what we are doing is trying to dig into the information that is being shared with us by those sites around the options that they have to develop high-level concept engineering ideas for each of those options, look at the costings, phasings, and execution plans for those so that we can develop at a site-by-site basis a pathway to net zero. But if you have the sites understood and you have the technologies understood, there's still a fundamental question that needs to be answered. And that's addressed on the last sort of major theme that we are looking at in our roadmap, which is how you integrate all of this together. And on the next slide, we look at how we do that. And our chosen tool is to develop a net zero energy system model. This will be a live dynamic modeling tool. It will be based on some of the tools that are currently in use across the UK and in Scotland at a national level, but it will be done at a far more refined level down to the kind of work that you need to look at on a site-by-site basis. Our net zero energy system model is looking at 3 key modules. Unsurprisingly, our first module is the industrial site module. What industrial processes need to be decarbonised, what on-site energy assets are available, what new infrastructure needs to be built inside the fence, and therefore how those pathways to net zero could be developed for the site itself. But the site doesn't live in isolation, and therefore we are then closely coupling that industrial site module to an infrastructure module. It's no good capturing carbon at an industrial site if you don't have a mechanism to transport and store that carbon. Nor is it very worthwhile doing a fuel switching solution to hydrogen if hydrogen isn't available on your doorstep. So the infrastructure module integrates all of the industrial site needs, checks that those needs are can be delivered both locally, but also rationalize them against the resources available in the national energy system and at a national level, and looks at therefore what the optimal infrastructure could be around greater electrification, around developing a hydrogen network, and crucially for CCS, around developing a CO2 transport and storage network. And then lastly, with those things understood, we recognize that whilst we are focused on industrial decarbonisation, there is likely to be a significant opportunity through the activities happening at industrial sites and the infrastructure that's developed to support them to decarbonize other portions of the economy. And in particular, we see that there will be regional solutions that could be put in place and co-investment could be made that allows those solutions to be used in areas such as domestic and commercial heating and heavy goods transportation. And whilst we won't be going too detailed into how those individual solutions could be deployed, we do think that a net zero energy system model will be a great way of identifying where those obvious synergistic opportunities exist. And all of that's going to be done across multiple scenarios because we do not have a single pathway to net zero, and we need to test different choices, different levels of adoption of hydrogen, of electrification, of CCUS, and that is going to be the test that we throw in as a set of scenarios into the energy system model itself. So on our last slide, to summarize the work that we're doing, in essence, our roadmap, and in many ways the roadmaps that are happening elsewhere across the UK, are trying to go from the site level problem to the regional roadmap solution, and to find ways and pathways to optimize that solution. So I've described that at the moment we're involved significantly in emitter engagement. We are roughly 6 months into a 24-month exercise to develop this roadmap. We expect to have some of the early phase solutions from our net zero energy system model by Q2 of next year. And ultimately, we will be outputting the scenarios, testing those scenarios as to what is most practical and most economic, and then refining those the scenarios that pass that initial test to try and deliver something that has been optimized for Scotland. And by doing that, hopefully create pathways and solutions that could be leveraged outside of Scotland. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, Mike, thank you very much for your insightful presentation. It's great to learn more about the thinking behind Scotland's net zero roadmap. Really helpful. Mike, I'm interested in understanding a little bit more about what happens beyond the roadmap. How might Scotland contribute to the decarbonisation of other parts of the UK, other parts of Europe, potentially the world? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think there are some real opportunities for Scotland, and if you think back to those natural strengths that we have and leaning into those strengths, we have great opportunity, I think, in Scotland to look at exporting hydrogen, so shipping hydrogen out of the region to regions where they might not have the natural strengths that allow them to produce that cost effectively. And we have a massive opportunity to import CO2. We have the port infrastructure, we have the pipeline and terminal infrastructure that can be redeployed to allow that to be built, but also scaled up very rapidly. And we have the geology, and it's very telling. There are 6 large clusters across the UK that are looking at roadmaps alongside the one that we're doing for Scotland. The 3 main regions south of the Mersey don't have any natural stores. It's going to be very hard for them to achieve net zero if they ultimately can't transport the CO2 that they capture to a large area with storage potential, such as Scotland. So that's one particular area. The other area where I think we can help is because of some of those natural strengths, I think Scotland will be one of the first areas to start to build this out at scale. And how that can help on a global basis is we're likely to see some of the first steps towards the standardization of components, the modularization of some of these solutions. And that is a fantastic opportunity on a global basis. Yeah, if we can do that, if by doing that, we can drive down the cost of deployment, and we can make these something that an industrial site can do on a sort of off-the-shelf basis, where these modules have been manufactured, you know, rather than fabricated. I think there's a fantastic opportunity for us to lead the way and the rest of the globe to follow.
Absolutely. I think standardization can be very helpful to help drive down costs. That's great. Lovely. Well, thank you, Mike. We'll return to you with some of the audience questions at the end. Let's now move across to Kirsty, who is going to tell us a little bit more about the Acorn project. Over to you, Kirsty.
Thanks, Jamie. Okay, so today I'm going to do just a really brief introduction to the Acorn project, and it's really just building on some of the points that you've heard already from Andy and from Mike. So you heard from my introduction that I've been working in low carbon energy. Actually, I've been totting up. It's actually over 12 years now, and with a number of CCS projects internationally as well. So it's just really exciting now to be focusing on project delivery for a real project and all the ups and downs that come with that. And at the moment, I have to say there are more ups than downs. So if you can flick forward, Jamie. I just think it is really an incredibly exciting time to be working in CCS in the UK and particularly in Scotland. I've lived through a number of false dawns and disappointments for this technology in the UK, but the change that I've seen since I started working at Pale Blue Dot back in 2018 really has been quite incredible. And I think the significance of that 2019 Climate Change Act and the policies that you heard a bit about earlier from Andy really shouldn't be underplayed. And for that international audience that's listening, the importance of those policies in helping create a framework to allow CCS to actually become a reality in our country is critical. Also, along with statements like you can see on this slide from the UK Committee on Climate Change, and there was some reports being released yesterday and today that have updated these, and still that commitment really is there across the board in the UK, which is really exciting. And it goes alongside this social and political environment that we're working in, just being markedly different in a really good way. But I have to say, I'm also really proud that the Acorn project that I'm going to talk about, and you're going to have to excuse my pun here, but it's rooted in learning from those past projects. So the ones that I mentioned where, you know, we have had challenges in the past and CCS has really struggled in the UK to get a foothold. But there is a huge amount of learning, both intellectually, but also of reuse of infrastructure and some of the work that's been done on these past projects is all you can see it injected in this project and in other projects that are happening across the UK now as well. First, just let me explain who's involved in Acorn. If you don't mind moving on, Jamie. Thanks. So Starega, who's the company that I work for, through wholly owned subsidiary Pale Blue Dot Energy, are the lead project developers for Acorn. And that's alongside our project partners, Shell and Harbour Energy. And the project also has received industry match funding, development support from both the UK, European and Scottish governments. Now, I live in a really small village in Scotland, and I quite often hear the phrase that it takes a village to raise a good child. Well, in our case with Acorn, it takes a whole cluster to raise a good Acorn project. If you don't mind moving on, Jamie, that'd be great. And this is just a screenshot of the Scottish Cluster web page, and it shows just some of the organisations that are showing their support for the creation of a Scottish cluster of industries, communities, businesses, all working together to deliver CCS, hydrogen and other low carbon technologies as well, all to help Scotland, the UK and Europe to meet our net zero goals. And the Acorn project basically provides the backbone CCS and hydrogen infrastructure for the Scottish cluster. Right now, we are in absolute depths of a really busy period just preparing a bid for UK government's cluster sequencing competition, its bidding process. And it's massively exciting. There's a lot of change going on, and a lot of emitters and different people are coming to the party and really getting behind this idea of a cluster. And I think it's an interesting area, because if you've been involved in CCS in the past, where we came from was really working on, point source emissions, so one great big power station and trying to capture its CO2 and deal with it. Whereas now, certainly in the UK, the shift has really shifted to this focus on this much more this cluster approach and this whole system approach that you heard from Mike. And I think it's made a huge difference in terms of the financing and just the entire approach to where CCS can make a difference, and really positioning it in the place that it always should have been as a climate mitigation technology. Do you mind just moving on, Jamie? Thanks. So let me just explain and show you what I mean about this backbone infrastructure for the Scottish cluster. So Acorn is one of the UK's most advanced carbon capture and storage and hydrogen projects. It's based right in the heart of the oil and gas industry on the northeast coast of Scotland. And the location is really quite a strategic one. We're based at a place called St Fergus, at the gas terminal at St Fergus. And we're based there because it gives us access to existing offshore pipelines that were used for bringing natural gas onshore, but they can be reused for taking CO2 offshore. And these pipes give us access to, you've heard multiple times now today, this really excellent storage resource, this excellent geological storage resource that we have in the North Sea off the coast of Scotland. And the Acorn Project has been quite far advanced. So I think back in 2018, if my memory serves me correctly, we had our license starting to get underway for the Acorn CO2 storage site. And that's the first kind of site that you can see there on the map, with the pipelines leading directly into that site. And that is it's a really critical part of this project. And when we talk, you heard Mike talk about infrastructure reuse and having a lot of really good access to data for that geological site. And all of that helps us to be able to deliver this project by the mid-2020s. So to actually have a carbon capture and storage, full chain, large scale carbon capture and storage project running in that time scale. And the access to all of this existing infrastructure and this knowledge and understanding of that store is what allows us to do that and to work speedily on that. You can see from the slide here that what we are looking to do is start with carbon dioxide emissions, existing carbon dioxide emissions from the St Fergus gas terminal itself, and build that up so that we would be dealing with between 5 to 10 million tonnes of CO2 every year by 2030. And that really is a significant volume of CO2 when you think about globally how much CO2 is being captured at the moment. It is a pretty significant ramp up, and it shows you just the volume of CO2 that can be stored in this North Sea storage resource. And I mentioned that, we're providing this backbone infrastructure, and this carbon capture and storage project is this backbone infrastructure that we talk about it being this sort of catalyst for clean growth. And that is because at that St Fergus gas terminal site, there's a fantastic opportunity for blue hydrogen production. So that's hydrogen production from natural gas. There is about 35% of natural gas that's used in the UK at the moment is brought in and processed at the St Fergus gas terminal. And what the carbon capture and storage project for Acorn allows us to do is to establish a hydrogen generation hub at St Fergus, where we can create hydrogen from the natural gas and manage that CO2, deal with that CO2 through our Acorn CCS system. Also, in the very nearby area, we've got access to the deepwater port at Peterhead, which allows us to provide a service for CO2 import facilities, as you heard from Mike. The Peterhead port is the one that's local to the Acorn project, but there are ports along the coast of Scotland and the coast in the UK. And this is from a CCS cluster perspective, this is a real huge opportunity to be able to develop these ports so that they can allow the import of CO2 to be allow us to access this great storage opportunity, and also to help regions which don't have easy access to CO2 storage opportunities to be able to decarbonise. And then finally, Mike has already alluded to this idea that because of establishing the CCS infrastructure, it opens up a whole world of possibilities for these other low carbon and carbon removal opportunities, such as direct air capture and BECCS as well. And there's been some announcements today around some direct air capture opportunities that we as a company are looking to develop in this Northeast Coast, because we have hopefully got this access to the Acorn CCS system. So hugely exciting opportunity. If you don't mind just moving on, Jamie, I think this is coming to my last slide. No, second last. So yeah, I just wanted to explain just in a little bit more detail. I mentioned about being able to be operational by the mid-2020s. Basically, we can do that because what we're looking to do with our carbon capture and storage project is capture these existing emissions at the St Fergus gas terminal and use that one of the existing pipelines, one of the 3 existing pipelines that we know is suitable for reuse for CO2 transportation, and it's the GoldenEye pipeline taking straight out to that Acorn CO2 storage site. The site that we are looking to start storing our CO2 in is one that has been really well developed in the past because of previous CO2 transportation and storage projects that have been investigated in this region. So we've got very, very high degree of confidence in those stores. And that allows us to establish that very large scale infrastructure and get access to the transportation and storage and very quickly scale up. So being able to quickly bring on additional pipelines and additional storage sites. And there is work ongoing internally at the moment, because we can see the interest in the availability of transportation and storage to actually build out and look at further storage site options for the Acorn project. If you don't mind moving on, Jamie. Thank you. So this is just to summarise. I had mentioned about the hydrogen project, the Acorn Hydrogen Project. Because of this easy access to natural gas, the Acorn Hydrogen Project, what we are planning on doing is starting with a 200 megawatt hydrogen production plant. It's a really, really scalable solution, and we're looking to scale as to meet demand at St Fergus. The real key about that is that at the St Fergus site, we've got access to the national transmission system, which is sort of the very large scale system where natural gas goes down through the country. We have an opportunity to blend hydrogen within that national transmission system, which would help to decarbonise that whole system. But also it means that we've got a backup system for when we're looking to create the excitement and generate that hydrogen market in the Northeast, and look at people who would be interested in 100% hydrogen solutions. But having the combination of those two things really helps us with the sort of financing and the scalability of these projects. We are looking at a very scalable project, so anything up to a gigawatt of hydrogen generation by 2030. So really exciting, and it's really important about establishing this kind of large scale hydrogen market to create that wider interest and excitement in hydrogen, to allow green hydrogen generation to come in and tap into these markets as well. A final piece that has been touched on already by Andy and Mike is that decarbonising Scotland's industry. So in the sort of central belt area of Scotland, you can see on that map we've got Grangemouth highlighted. That's the sort of real industrial emissions piece within Scotland. We are looking for the Acorn CO2 transportation and storage solution to provide the CO2 solution for that industrial decarbonisation process at the central belt. And you can see here that we've got 90% of Scotland's large site emissions are within 50 kilometres of this onshore natural gas pipeline that can be reused for CO2 transportation. So another really exciting opportunity. And the Peterhead port that I mentioned is just 8 miles from the St Fergus gas terminal, which opens up this opportunity for a CO2 import from around the UK and Europe as well. And then just the final point on the store, you heard some really impressive figures from Mike already. And the one that we tend to talk about is that 30% of the UK's CO2 storage lies just within 50 kilometres of those 3 St Fergus pipeline corridors, those offshore pipelines that go to the stores in the central North Sea. So a really exciting project that we are just desperate to get going with, and hopefully to unlock all of these great opportunities that you've been hearing to create this cluster effect within Scotland that we can really make a dent on our carbon dioxide emissions and our industrial emissions in particular. Jamie, I think it's just a thank you slide for me at the end.
Lovely. Well, Kirsty, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm conscious we're running a little bit behind time, so I'm just going to jump straight to audience questions, if that's okay. I've been just taking a look at some of those. I've seen we have several questions in relation to jobs. Just, I guess, to summarize those, what skills are needed to deliver the Acorn project and indeed the wider net zero roadmap? I'll perhaps ask you to respond to that first, Kirsty, and then Mike, if you'd like to come in.
Sure. So, I mean, the whole concept of this energy transition is CCS and hydrogen are really pillars of that energy transition. And I mentioned that this project takes place in the sort of heart of the oil and gas industry, and there's widespread recognition that the oil and gas industry is in transition, and these roles that are provided by these projects are very suited to that that sector, a transition of that sector, because the skills and the knowledge that's required to work offshore, the engineering and of gas handling, all of these things are really directly comparable to that oil and gas sector. And also, it's not just about the creation of new jobs within that low carbon energy space. It's about preservation of existing jobs by allowing our heavy emitting industries the ability to decarbonise and to exist in a net zero environment. That is about preserving the jobs that exist within those industries, and that is just as important as the new job creation that's allowed by these pretty substantial infrastructure projects as well. Mike, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Just to highlight that, I think we're increasingly thinking about two phasing of jobs. There's the construction phase, and there, when you look at individual projects, you quite quickly get to sort of a thousand or so jobs for a large decarbonising project. Several projects acting together as part of a cluster, you quickly get to sort of 5,000 to 10,000 jobs in that construction phase. But perhaps just as interesting is the longer term operational jobs. And whilst they're potentially lower, you may be looking at a couple of thousand rather than tens of thousands, they are jobs that, are evergreen, tend to be highly skilled, tend to be highly paid. And then lastly, the supply chain that you engage to do this, though their skills, their knowledge is something that then the rest of the globe will want to tie into. Whoever's had knowledge of first of a kind projects where that learning can be shared, whoever has the understanding as to how to deliver these projects within a certain regulatory regime, and that regulatory regime is likely to be similar across most of the Western world at least, has a leg up when it comes to using those resources elsewhere in the world.
And I think even
so follow on question, Mike.
Of course.
So I was just going to ask, do you think there might be an export opportunity in the future?
Yes, I do, and in fact, NECCUS is working with BEIS, the sort of industrial department for the UK government, and with the CCSA, which is the UK-wide CCS association, to look at this. We think there are significant opportunities here. We think the export opportunities are likely to be, for the UK at least, in high-value manufacturing of some of the key components. And particularly if we can move that from fabricating components, which has traditionally been the approach that has been used in the oil and gas sector offshore, into the manufacturing of these components, and that fits with the idea of standardization and modularization. But we also see the actual design and engineering integration, which is something that Scotland and the oil and gas industry in Scotland has traditionally done for projects around the globe. We can almost directly port that experience and skill base into this area.
That's great, thank you. We've received several questions regarding the storage facility that will be used for Acorn. In particular, people are interested in understanding whether you're planning to use depleted gas fields or saline aquifers. Could you perhaps answer that question, Kirsty?
Sure. So our starting point that I mentioned to get us kick-started by the mid-2020s is using it's new wells being drilled, and it's in a former it's in a saline aquifer, but it's in a former gas reservoir site. So it's using the GoldenEye site that has been previously there's been a huge amount of work done on previous projects, previous iterations of CCS projects in the UK. But the whole of that Acorn CO2 storage site is a very large aquifer base that there's multiple opportunities for storage beyond those sites. That it's sandstone that we can tap into there, and the wider CO2 storage opportunity around there's is looking at saline aquifer sites. That's where you get to those very large volumes of CO2 storage.
That's great. Thank you, Kirsty. We've received a few questions in relation to business and commercial models. Just reading out Colin Smith's question here. So has a commercial model been established for Acorn? Is government subsidy anticipated to be a key part of the funding?
So it's ongoing. I mentioned that we are right in the midst of the cluster sequencing bid process. So there will be an element of government subsidy for these initial CCS clusters, for all of the initial UK CCS clusters. I think the thing which is really exciting, and I've worked on at least 3 or 4 different carbon capture and storage projects, and what I've seen evolve over time is the private investment interest, and I think that's absolutely critical, is bringing that commercialization to carbon capture and storage and hydrogen, and some of the other low carbon technologies that we've been talking about. This initial phase in the UK will have an element of public subsidy, but the ambition is to move as quickly as possible on to try and commercialise this opportunity.
Okay, great. We've received some questions about CO2 shipping and specifically whether Scotland might be able to accept CO2 from other parts of Europe. I don't know if you'd like to answer that question initially, Mike, and then maybe Andy, you have some views on that.
Sure. I think the North Sea facing countries, they have a common, I think, objective to try and put the most resilient carbon capture and storage infrastructure in place as possible. And yet each of some of those countries, Germany's a good example, doesn't have the natural geology, and other countries, the Netherlands, Denmark, they potentially only have 1 or 2 sites. There is far more industrial emissions in those nations than maybe their natural stores can accommodate. And if we want to build a resilient set of stores, we need to be able to interchange where the carbon is taken to, because no single store will necessarily be available 365 days a year. there will inevitably be downtimes. So I do think that Scotland offers a fantastic opportunity to take CO2, particularly from Northwest Europe and those North Sea facing countries. We did some analysis and found across the 7 North Sea facing countries, there is approximately 440 million tonnes of CO2 emissions per annum from industry. Yeah, there really is only 2 places that can start to handle that at scale. That's Scotland and our neighbours across the water in Norway.
Great. Andy, anything to add?
Yeah, I think Mike's picked a key point here, which is I think the amount of CO2 in Europe is going to vastly outweigh the size of the stores in the short term. There is lots of carbon to be captured. So this, I don't think this is an issue for competition. This is very much one that developing stores in collaboration is absolutely the model to go for. It builds resilience and it will build a market over time. And I think for government, that presents some interesting problems, the types of problems that government should be there to fix. So things like the infrastructure challenges associated with that, the regulatory frameworks around that, and the collaboration between countries. So from Scottish Government's perspective, multiple countries developing stores is exactly the sort of model we'd want to see.
Excellent, excellent. Well, Andy, Mike, Kirsty, thank you so much for the insight that you've shared today. I'm conscious that we're rapidly running out of time, so I think we'll have to leave it there now. Thank you very much for your presentations. I will just move across to our closing slide. Today, Andy told us about Scotland's plans to deliver net zero by 2045 and the importance of CCS to that. CCS is vital to reaching net zero emissions by the middle of the century. Mike spoke about the various industrial sites within Scotland's net zero roadmap. CCS is the only technology able to decarbonise hard to abate industry. For some emission sources, there really are no credible alternatives to CCS. Kirsty told us about the Acorn Project and its plans to reuse pipeline infrastructure. There are many projects around the world which are finding new ways to drive deployment costs down. CCS is cost effective and costs continue to decrease with further deployment. If you'd like to learn more about CCS, you can follow the Institute on social media for regular updates. Visit our website to access both the recording of today's webinar and our various publications, including our flagship Global Status of CCS report. And finally, you can access our core database, where you'll find details of operational CCS facilities around the world and those in development. A final thanks to our speakers today. We really appreciate the insight that you've been able to share. And thanks to you, our audience, for your interest in CCS deployment there in Scotland. We hope that you have a great day. Thank you very much.